The sun cast long shadows over Salvation Springs as a single gunshot shattered the dawn silence. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the dust of Devil's Gulch, their blood darkening the thirsty earth. Above them stood a woman in black, her red hair catching the dying light like fire. Folks would later say that the most dangerous predator in Salvation Springs wasn't the rattlers or the coyotes. It was the widow who ran the boarding house on the edge of town. But nobody believed that. Not until the day the Viper brothers came riding in. Victoria Hawthorne's day began like any other, with the methodical precision that had become her armor. The boarding house she ran stood at the edge of Salvation Springs, a testament to order in a lawless land. Every morning she'd polish the brass doorknobs until they gleamed, sweep the wooden porch until it shone, and serve breakfast to her boarders with a quiet efficiency that revealed nothing of who she truly was. The routine was her sanctuary, each task a brick in the wall she'd built between her past and present. The late summer air hung heavy with the promise of change, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth through the open windows. Victoria stood on her porch, watching the town come to life through eyes that missed nothing. Her simple black dress and carefully pinned red hair marked her as a respectable widow. But there was something else in her bearing, something that spoke of a different life, buried but not forgotten. The way she moved, the way her eyes constantly scanned her surroundings, told a story different from the one she presented to the world. "Morning, Mrs. Hawthorne," Pearl Sullivan called out as she hurried past with supplies for her general store. "Will you be joining us for the church social this Sunday?" Pearl's enthusiasm barely masked her pity, the same pity Victoria saw in most townsfolk's eyes when they looked at the poor widow who'd arrived 3 years ago. Victoria's smile was polite but distant, practiced to perfection. "Thank you kindly, Pearl, but I've got boarders to tend to." The same answer she'd given every Sunday for 3 years, ever since she'd arrived in Salvation Springs, with nothing but a small trunk and secrets heavy enough to sink a soul. The trunk remained locked beneath her bed, its contents untouched but never forgotten. Inside the boarding house, memories lurked in every shadow. The mantelpiece held 2 items she never touched, but always watched: a wedding band hanging from a silver chain and a sepia photograph of Thomas Hawthorne, her dead husband. His kind eyes seemed to follow her as she moved through her morning routine, serving coffee to the traveling salesman, eggs to the elderly couple, and fresh bread to the young schoolteacher who always blushed when she passed his table. Each guest received the same measured attention, like pieces on a chessboard she'd learned to navigate with careful precision. Dr. Eleanor Whitaker sat at her usual place in the kitchen, watching Victoria knead bread dough with hands that once knew the weight of a Colt 45 better than a rolling pin. The morning light caught the silver strands in Eleanor's dark hair, marking the years they'd known each other, years filled with unspoken understanding and carefully guarded secrets. 3 years you've been running this boarding house, Victoria," Eleanor said, her coffee cooling forgotten before her. "Don't you ever think about what, Eleanor?" Victoria's voice cut through the air like a knife. "About before, that life's dead and buried, along with your husband." Eleanor's words were gentle but probing. "Thomas isn't here to want anything." Victoria's hands stilled in the dough. "And that woman he married, she died with him." The words hung in the air like gun smoke, heavy with unspoken grief and harder truths. The conversation died as shouts erupted from outside. Both women moved to the window, watching as 3 riders approached from the east, their horses kicking up dust clouds that blotted out the morning sun. Victoria's hand moved unconsciously to her right thigh, where a gun belt used to rest, muscle memory betraying years of careful pretense. The movement didn't escape Eleanor's notice, but the doctor remained silent, understanding more than most the cost of speaking certain truths aloud. "More travelers for your boarding house?" Eleanor asked, but Victoria was already shaking her head, her face set in lines Eleanor hadn't seen in years. "No." Her voice had changed, grown harder, colder. "Those aren't travelers." She recognized the type. Men who wore violence like others wore Sunday clothes, comfortable in its familiar fit. The Viper brothers rode into Salvation Springs like a storm rolling down from Thunder Ridge. Their reputation preceded them, whispered in saloons and telegraph offices across 3 territories. People hurried inside at their approach. Doors slammed shut and shutters closed with the finality of coffin lids. But in her kitchen, Victoria Hawthorne stood straight and still, watching. For a moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something beneath, something dangerous and eternal, like steel catching sunlight. Marshal Everett McCullough rode past on his morning patrol, his eyes meeting Victoria's through the window. A look of understanding passed between them, heavy with shared knowledge and unspoken warnings. He was one of the few who knew what lay beneath her widow's weeds, one of the few who remembered the woman she used to be. His hand rested casually on his holster as he passed the newcomers, marking them, measuring them, just as she did from her window. As the dust settled around the Viper brothers' horses, Victoria turned back to her bread dough, her movements precise and controlled. But something had changed in the air of Salvation Springs, something that whispered of violence to come. "So it begins again," she murmured, and in those words lay the weight of a past about to catch up with her present. The shadow of Thunder Ridge stretched across the town like a warning, and in her immaculate boarding house, Victoria Ember Hawthorne prepared herself for what she knew was coming. She'd buried her old life once, along with her husband, but some things refused to stay buried, and some women refused to be victims twice. The time was coming when Salvation Springs would learn why they called her Ember, because even the smallest spark can ignite an inferno. The Viper brothers didn't waste time making their presence known in Salvation Springs. By noon, their laughter echoed from the saloon, sharp and dangerous as broken glass. Silas, the eldest, sat with his back to the wall, eyes constantly moving, cataloging every detail of his surroundings. Jeremiah nursed his whiskey at the bar, while Nathaniel, the youngest, amused himself by making the piano player perform with a gun trained on his trembling hands. The old man's fingers stumbled over the keys, each wrong note drawing snickers from the youngest Viper. Victoria watched from her boarding house window as Marcus Drake, their enforcer, led their horses to the livery stable. His movements were deliberate, professional, a man who knew his trade well. She recognized the way he walked, the same way she used to move before she buried that life under widow's weeds and respectability. The way his eyes swept the street, noting escape routes and vantage points, told her more about him than any wanted poster could. "They're staying," Eleanor observed from behind, her voice tight with concern, the doctor's weathered hands clutching her medical bag, knuckles white with tension. "Yes." Victoria's response was clipped, her fingers absently touching the hidden pocket in her skirts where she kept a small derringer, a habit she'd never quite broken. "They always do, once they find a town worth bleeding dry, like wolves finding a flock without a shepherd." The afternoon stretched long and tense like a drawn bowstring waiting for release. Victoria went about her usual routine, changing linens, preparing dinner for her boarders, keeping the accounts in her precise handwriting. But beneath every mundane action lay a current of anticipation. Like the stillness before a thunderstorm, her other boarders had picked up on the tension. The traveling salesman made excuses to leave early, while the elderly couple locked themselves in their room, speaking in whispers. It was just past sunset when the first shot rang out, splitting the evening air like summer lightning. Victoria was in her kitchen kneading dough for tomorrow's bread when she heard the commotion, shouting from the street, then the sound of breaking glass from Pearl Sullivan's general store. She wiped her hands clean, moved to the window, and watched as Nathaniel Viper stumbled out of the store laughing, a bottle of expensive whiskey in his hand. Pearl followed him to the door, her face flushed with anger, her normally neat gray hair coming loose from its pins. "You have to pay for that." Pearl's voice carried across the street. "This isn't some lawless territory. We have rules here, civilization." Nathaniel turned, his young face twisted into something ugly. "Oh? And who's going to make me? That tired old marshal?" He took a long drink from the bottle, then hurled it against the store's front wall, sending glass shards glittering in the dying light. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo off Thunder Ridge itself. Victoria's hands clenched at her sides, remembering other men, other towns, other moments when civilization hung by a thread. She watched as Marshal McCullough emerged from his office, moving with deliberate slowness, the leather of his holster creaking with each step, the sound carrying in the sudden silence that had fallen over the street. But before he could reach the scene, Silas Viper appeared, placing himself between his younger brother and the law. "There seems to be some misunderstanding." Silas's voice was smooth as oil on water. "We'll be happy to pay for any damages." He flicked a coin toward Pearl, the gold catching the last rays of sunlight. "That should cover it, with interest." The coin landed in the dust at Pearl's feet, an insult masked as restitution. The marshal's hand hadn't moved from his gun. "Money's not the point, Viper. This is a peaceful town. We like it that way." His eyes, hard as flint, never left Silas's face. "And we're peaceful men." Silas smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "When treated with respect." The threat in his words hung in the air like gun smoke. Victoria saw it then, the slight nod Silas gave to someone behind the marshal. Marcus Drake had positioned himself in the shadows of the undertaker's shop, his hand hovering near his holster. One wrong move and Salvation Springs would have a dead marshal on its hands. The town would fall like so many others, becoming just another conquest for men who fed on fear. Without conscious thought, Victoria found herself moving. She stepped out onto her porch, the evening air cool against her face, her black dress whispering against the wooden boards, the sound carrying memories of another life, another woman who wouldn't stand by while violence took root. "Gentlemen," her voice carried across the street, clear and commanding. "If you're looking for lodging, I have rooms available at my boarding house." All eyes turned to her. She felt Silas Viper's gaze like a physical touch, assessing, measuring. She kept her posture relaxed, her face pleasant, the widow offering Christian charity to travelers. But inside, old instincts stirred, reading the positions of every man in the street, noting angles, distances, lines of fire. She could feel the weight of her derringer pressing against her thigh, like a reminder of who she used to be. "Well now," Silas's smile widened as he turned fully toward her. "That's mighty hospitable of you, Mrs. Victoria Hawthorne." She inclined her head slightly. "Clean beds, hot meals, and reasonable rates, provided my house rules are respected." Each word was carefully chosen, a gambit in a game she'd played before. Nathaniel laughed, the sound harsh in the gathering dusk. "House rules? In a dump like this? Shut up, Nathaniel." Silas's voice carried a warning edge. He studied Victoria for a moment longer, then nodded. "We'd be obliged, Mrs. Hawthorne. My brothers and I appreciate civilization's comforts." The way he said civilization made it sound like a joke. Victoria maintained her smile as they gathered their belongings and approached her boarding house. Marshal McCullough caught her eye, a question in his gaze. She gave him the slightest shake of her head. This was her choice, her gambit. Better to have them under her roof where she could watch them than leaving them free to terrorize the town. As she showed the Viper brothers to their rooms, Victoria felt the weight of their presence like a storm cloud above her carefully ordered world. She'd seen their type before, in another life, men who confused courtesy with weakness, who saw kindness as an invitation to cruelty. Their boots left mud on her clean floors, a small desecration that promised larger ones to come. "Dinner's at 6, she informed them, her voice neutral. "No weapons at the table, no smoking in the rooms, and no disturbing the other guests." "Or what?" Nathaniel challenged, leaning against the doorframe with calculated insolence, his spurs jingling as he shifted. a sound like rattling bones. Victoria met his gaze, letting her mask slip just enough to show him something in her eyes that made him straighten up. Or you'll find other accommodations. The steel in her voice wasn't entirely hidden now, and she saw recognition flicker across Silas's face, a predator recognizing another of its kind. Later, as she locked up for the night, Victoria heard Eleanor's quiet footsteps behind her. "You're playing a dangerous game," the doctor warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "No game," Victoria replied, checking the lock one final time. "Just keeping my enemies close." She touched the derringer in her pocket, a habit born of hard experience. And preparing for when they show their true nature, the night settled over Salvation Springs like a dark blanket, but few slept easily. Above the town, Thunder Ridge stood silent against the star-filled sky, as if waiting to witness what tomorrow would bring. In her room, Victoria sat in the darkness, listening to the heavy footsteps of the Viper brothers in the rooms above, and remembered another night when she'd waited in darkness, gun in hand, for violence to find her. Dawn broke over Salvation Springs with an angry red sky, painting Thunder Ridge in colors of blood and fire. Victoria stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun rise while her hands mechanically worked bread dough. She hadn't slept, the weight of the Viper brothers' presence above her keeping rest at bay. The floorboards had creaked well past midnight, their boots pacing like caged animals. The morning brought an uneasy quiet to her boarding house. The elderly couple had checked out at first light, leaving money on their dresser, rather than risk a face-to-face encounter with their new fellow boarders. The traveling salesman had vanished even earlier, his room key left on the front desk without a word. Only the young schoolteacher remained, his face pale as he hurried through breakfast. Clearing out like rats from a sinking ship, Silas Viper's voice came from behind her, smooth as snake scales. Victoria didn't startle. She'd heard his footsteps on the stairs, counting the rhythm of his approach. "Most folks prefer quiet company," she replied, not turning from her work. Her fingers kept kneading, though every nerve in her body screamed at having him at her back. "Quiet can be overrated, Mrs. Hawthorne." He moved closer, and she could smell tobacco and gun oil on him. Sometimes a little excitement is just what a town needs, especially a town like this, with such an interesting resident. Victoria's hands stilled in the dough. "Interesting, Mr. Viper." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Take yourself, for instance. A widow running a boarding house all alone. It must be difficult managing everything by yourself. Never know what kind of trouble might come calling." The threat lay on his words like a rattler under a rock. Victoria resumed kneading, her movements measured. "I manage well enough, Mr. Viper. Coffee's hot if you want it." He chuckled, the sound dark as storm clouds. "You know, the thing about widows is they're often in need of protection. Dangerous times we live in." "Indeed they are." Victoria turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. She met his gaze steadily, letting none of her thoughts show on her face. Though some dangers are more obvious than others. Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the street. Both of them moved to the window, watching as Nathaniel Viper squared off against young Deputy James Crawford outside the saloon. The morning sun caught the deputy's badge, making it shine like a target. "Your brother seems eager for excitement," Victoria observed quietly. "Nathaniel's young," Silas replied, his tone dismissive. "Hot-blooded. Sometimes he needs teaching about respect." But he made no move to intervene, as his youngest brother continued to bait the deputy. Victoria watched the scene unfold, her heart turning to ice as she recognized the setup. Nathaniel playing drunk and belligerent, keeping the deputy's attention. Jeremiah positioned casually to the side, one hand resting near his gun, and Marcus Drake moving through the shadows of the alley behind Crawford, silent as death. She knew their kind and had seen their work before. They'd start small, a deputy first, then perhaps the marshal. Once the law was gone, they'd own the town, Pearl's store, Josiah Winchester's bank. Every business would pay for protection. Those who refused would have accidents. She'd seen it happen in 3 towns during her previous life, before she'd met Thomas and found a different path. Thomas. The thought of him sent a familiar pain through her chest. He'd believed in law and civilization, in building something better than the world of violence she'd known, and she'd believed in him. Let him show her another way to live. Until the day 3 men like the Vipers had taken it all away. The sound of a gunshot cracked through her memory. Deputy Crawford lay in the dust, clutching his shoulder, while Nathaniel stood over him laughing. The boy's first kill, Victoria realized, watching his face. The moment when a man first learns he can take life and face no consequences. Shame, Silas said beside her, his voice carrying no shame at all. Boy should have shown more respect. Your brother shot an officer of the law. Victoria's fingers found the derringer in her pocket, an old friend offering cold comfort. Self-defense? Silas shrugged. Everyone saw the deputy draw first. Didn't they, Mrs. Hawthorne? She turned to face him fully then, letting her mask slip just enough to show him what lay beneath. I saw nothing, Mr. Viper. I was too busy thinking about protection and who truly needs it in these dangerous times. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or warning. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and left her kitchen, his spurs jingling a deadly promise. When Eleanor arrived an hour later to tend to the deputy's wound, she found Victoria sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the wedding band that normally hung on the mantel. The silver chain pooled around it like a snake. They're not leaving, Eleanor said quietly, setting her medical bag down. Not until they've bled this town dry. No, Victoria agreed, her voice distant. They're not leaving. She picked up the wedding band, feeling its weight in her palm. But someone is. Eleanor's breath caught. Victoria, the woman who wears black and bakes bread, died the moment they shot that boy. Victoria stood, her movement liquid, predatory, a glimpse of who she'd been before Thomas. Time for the other one to wake up. There's no coming back from that path, Eleanor warned. Not this time. Victoria slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the familiar metal like a key unlocking a door she'd kept sealed for years. I'm not looking to come back. She moved to the window, watching as Nathaniel and his brothers celebrated at the saloon. Just to finish something that should have been finished long ago. Above the town, Thunder Ridge caught the midday sun, its shadow reaching toward Salvation Springs like judgment. Victoria felt the weight of the derringer in her pocket, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself remember every lesson, every skill, every death she'd dealt before Thomas had shown her another way. Her widow's weeds suddenly felt like a costume, a disguise she'd worn too long. The time for masks was ending. The woman who'd been born in violence and baptized in gunsmoke was stirring, and Salvation Springs would soon learn why they'd once called her Ember, because she could burn everything to ash when the wind was right. Victoria rode out of Salvation Springs as the moon rose over Thunder Ridge, her black dress exchanged for riding clothes she'd kept buried in an old trunk. The derringer was no longer hidden in her pocket, but strapped openly to her thigh, a companion she'd neglected too long. Her horse's hooves kicked up dust that glittered in the moonlight as she followed the old mining trail toward Whiskey Creek. Marshal McCullough had given her the information she needed, his words careful, but pointed during their brief encounter behind the livery stable. Man, you're looking for camps up by the old silver mine, he'd said, not asking why she needed to know. Rides with 2 others. Used to work with the Vipers before going his own way. If anyone knows their weaknesses. The trail grew steeper as she climbed, the air turning thin and sharp in her lungs. Victoria remembered another night ride 3 years ago, fleeing rather than hunting. She'd been a different woman then, running from the violence that had claimed Thomas. Now she was riding toward it, deliberate as a bullet finding its mark. The camp appeared exactly where McCullough said it would be, a small fire marking its location like a fallen star. 2 horses were tethered nearby, their shapes dark against the mountainside. Victoria dismounted quietly, leading her horse the last 100 yards. As she approached, A voice cut through the darkness. That's close enough, unless you're looking to die tonight. Victoria recognized the voice. Older, rougher, but unmistakable. Hello, Griffin, she called softly, still lingering in the shadows. A pause, then the sound of movement. A figure emerged from the darkness, rifle lowered but ready. Samuel Griffin stood like a ghost from her past, his face weathered as old leather, his eyes sharp as obsidian under the brim of his hat. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed. Little Emily Ember Reeves. Though I hear it's Victoria Hawthorne now. It was. Victoria stepped into the firelight. Not anymore. Griffin studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the fire. Suppose you better sit down and tell me what brings Thomas Hawthorne's widow up my mountain in the middle of the night. The fire cast dancing shadows as Victoria explained about the Viper brothers, about Deputy Crawford, about the familiar pattern of violence taking root in Salvation Springs. Griffin listened without interruption, occasionally stoking the fire with a stick that had been worn smooth by years of use. So, he said finally, you're looking to get back in the game after all your husband's talks about civilization and redemption. Thomas is dead. Victoria's voice was flat. Along with his dream of civilization. The world's still tooth and claw, Griffin. I was a fool to pretend otherwise. Maybe. Griffin pulled a bottle from his saddlebag, took a drink, and passed it to her. Or maybe you were right to try for something better. The question is, what are you really after? Justice or just revenge? Does it matter? Matters more than you think. Griffin's voice took on the tone she remembered from years ago, when he'd first taught her to shoot. Revenge is a quick draw and a faster trigger. Justice, that takes patience, precision, the kind of skill that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Victoria took a long drink from the bottle, letting the whiskey burn away the taste of bread flour and respectability. I remember who I was, Griffin. Who I am. Do you? He leaned forward, firelight carving deep shadows in his face. The Emily I knew was wild, reckless, shot first and counted the bodies later. But this, he gestured at her, this is something different. 3 years of playing widow has changed you. Whether you admit it or not, changed me into what? Maybe into someone who can do what needs doing without losing herself in the process. Griffin stood, moving to his saddlebags. The Vipers? They're not just thugs. Silas is smart, calculating. He'll expect the old Emily, all fire and fury. But a woman who's learned patience, who knows both sides of the line between civilization and savagery. He pulled out a gun belt, the leather dark with age and use. Victoria recognized it immediately. The rig she'd worn in her days riding with Griffin's crew. The Colt 45 still sat in its holster, maintained despite years of disuse. Kept it clean, Griffin said quietly, just in case you ever needed reminding of who you were, who you could be. Victoria stood, her fingers trailing over the familiar leather. I can't go back to that life, Griffin. No, he agreed. But maybe you can take the best parts of both lives. The skill, the precision of who you were, the patience, the judgment of who you've become. He held out the gun belt. The question is, are you ready to be both women at once? The weight of the gun belt felt like coming home as she buckled it around her waist. The Colt sat differently than her Derringer. Not hidden, but declared, a statement of intent. The Vipers have to be stopped, she said, before they destroy everything Thomas believed in, everything I've built. Griffin nodded slowly. Then let's see if you remember how to dance with the devil without becoming one. He moved toward the fire's edge, into the shadows. Show me your draw. Let's see what 3 years of kneading bread has done to your speed. Victoria's hand found the Colt's grip, familiar as a lover's touch. In the darkness above, Thunder Ridge stood witness as she began to rebuild herself, piece by piece, into something new. Not quite the widow, not quite the gunslinger, but something forged in the space between civilization and savagery. The moon climbed higher as Griffin's voice carried her back through years of forgotten lessons, each word another step on the path she'd chosen. In Salvation Springs below, the Viper brothers slept, unaware that their nightmare was taking shape in the mountain shadow. Guided by the hands of a man who'd once been the devil himself, Dawn found Victoria back at her boarding house, her muscles aching from hours of practice with Griffin. The Colt weighed heavy on her hip, hidden beneath a long duster coat. Her fingers, usually dusted with flour, now carried the familiar smell of gun oil and leather. The transformation had begun, but with it came doubts, crowding her mind like storm clouds over Thunder Ridge. The Viper brothers were already making themselves at home in her dining room, their loud laughter cutting through the morning quiet. Victoria paused in the kitchen doorway, watching them. Silas sat in Thomas's old chair, his boots propped on her clean tablecloth. The sight made something twist inside her, a reminder of the civilized life she was choosing to abandon. "Coffee, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Nathaniel called out, his young face split in a mocking grin. "Or are you too busy sneaking around at night?" Victoria's hand twitched, muscle memory reaching for the Colt, but she forced herself to stay calm, to maintain her widow's facade. "Coffee will be ready shortly," she replied, moving to the stove. Every step was a conscious effort to keep her new rhythm hidden, to move like the baker of bread rather than the dealer of death. "Interesting times in Salvation Springs," Silas observed, his voice carrying that perpetual undertone of amusement. "Deputy Crawford's still laid up with that shoulder wound. Marshall's been awfully quiet. And now I hear Samuel Griffin's been spotted up in the hills." Victoria kept her back turned, measuring coffee grounds with steady hands. "I wouldn't know about such things." "No?" Jeremiah spoke up, his voice rough as gravel. "Funny, seeing as how your horse's hooves were mighty dirty this morning. Been riding far, Mrs. Hawthorne?" The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring. Victoria could feel their eyes on her back, predators sensing a change in their prey. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands teaching her to bake, to build, to believe in something better than violence. What would he think of her now? "My business is my own, gentlemen," she finally replied, turning to face them with the coffee pot. "As yours is yours." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with new interest. "You know, there's something familiar about you, Mrs. Hawthorne. Something in the way you moved this morning. Reminds me of stories I used to hear years back about a woman they called Ember." The coffee pot trembled slightly in Victoria's hand as she poured their cups, not from fear, but from the effort of restraining herself. One quick draw, 3 shots. She could end it now. But Griffin's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Patience, precision, justice takes time. "Those sound like violent stories, Mr. Viper," she said carefully. "Not suitable for a widow's breakfast table." Marcus Drake chose that moment to enter, his quiet footsteps marking him as the professional he was. He noticed the tension immediately, one hand drifting toward his gun. "Easy, Marcus," Silas waved him down. "Mrs. Hawthorne and I were just discussing history. Ancient history, isn't that right?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "The past is best left buried, Mr. Viper, along with those who can't let it rest." The threat hung in the air between them, subtle as a snake in the grass. Silas's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Indeed it is, Mrs. Hawthorne. Indeed it is." After they left for the saloon, Eleanor arrived to find Victoria standing in her kitchen, staring at the coffee cups left scattered on her once pristine table. "You've started down the path," Eleanor observed quietly. "I can see it in your bearing." "Griffin's been teaching me again," Victoria admitted. "Or perhaps just reminding me, but..." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand gentle on Victoria's arm. Victoria picked up Thomas's photograph from the mantel, studying his kind face. 3 years, Eleanor. 3 years of building something clean and good, of proving that violence isn't the only way. If I do this, if I become her again, what was it all for? Perhaps it was preparation. Eleanor's voice carried the certainty of one who had seen too much of both healing and hurting. the question isn't whether you can be both women. It's whether you can accept that both are needed. Sometimes the only way to protect what's good is to remember how to be dangerous. Victoria's fingers traced the outline of the Colt under her duster. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a homeland changed by time and weather. She thought of Nathaniel's laugh as Deputy Crawford fell, of Silas's boots on her clean tablecloth, of the fear in Pearl Sullivan's eyes. "I told myself I was doing this for justice," she whispered. "But sometimes, in the dark, I can feel the old hunger, the desire to make them suffer as Thomas suffered, as I suffered. What if I start and can't stop? What if Ember burns everything, even the good parts?" Eleanor picked up one of the scattered coffee cups, examining the dregs left behind. "You know what I see? I see a woman strong enough to build a new life from ashes, strong enough to help others when she could have hidden away. That strength doesn't vanish just because you pick up a gun again." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained clear. Victoria moved to the window, watching the Viper brothers emerge from the saloon. They moved like wolves among sheep, confident in their power over the town. But wolves, she remembered, weren't the only predators in nature. "Griffin says I need to find balance," she said finally, "between the widow and the warrior, between justice and revenge. And what do you say?" Victoria touched Thomas's wedding band, still hanging from its chain. "I say it's time to show them why they called me Ember. Not because I burned everything down, but because even the smallest spark, properly placed, can start a cleansing fire." Above Salvation Springs, Thunder Ridge stood eternal, indifferent to the struggles of those in its shadow. But perhaps, Victoria thought, it had seen enough of evil men destroying good things. Perhaps it was time for something different, a woman who knew both creation and destruction, ready to use both in defense of what mattered. The old silver mine echoed with gunshots as the first rays of sun touched Thunder Ridge. Victoria stood in the shadow of the mine entrance, her Colt smoking in her hand, while 6 tin cans lay scattered in the dust. Not one remained standing on the fence posts where Griffin had placed them. "Again," Griffin commanded, already moving to reset the targets. "Faster this time. Remember, the Vipers won't stand still like tin cans." Victoria reloaded with practiced efficiency, her movements growing smoother with each repetition. The past 3 days had burned away her hesitation like morning fog in the desert sun. The widow's gentle hands had remembered their older purpose, calluses forming where once there had been flower burns. "You're still thinking too much," Griffin observed, stepping back from the targets. "Still trying to be both women at once. Let go of the widow. She can come back when this is done." Victoria's jaw tightened. "The widow is what keeps me human, Griffin. What stops me from becoming like them? The widow is what'll get you killed." Griffin's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You can't serve 2 masters in a gunfight. Can't be thinking about fresh-baked bread when the lead's flying." The next 6 shots rang out before he finished speaking. This time the cans didn't just fall. They flew apart, torn by bullets placed with surgical precision. Victoria lowered her smoking gun, her eyes cold as mountain frost. "What are you looking for?" Griffin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Getting there. Now let's see you do it from horseback." The morning wore on, each exercise more demanding than the last. Victoria rode, shot, reloaded again and again until her arms ached and her horse was lathered with sweat. Griffin pushed her relentlessly, recreating every dirty trick the Vipers,